Welcome everyone to this February 25 session of the Money Laundering Research Network webinars, monthly webinars. Today we will have as speakers two of the co-founders of this network, namely Mirko Nazzari, University of Sassari, and Peter Reuter, University of Maryland, who unfortunately cannot join today. And also we will have an in-house discussant as well, so another co-founder of this network, Mark Nance. So before leaving the floor to Mirko and Mark, just to remind you about the next events. So on March 13th, we will have two authors from the Italian FIU, and namely Marco De Simone and Antonio Pellegrini, who will be presenting a study on buffer companies used in complex tax fraud and financial crime schemes. While on April the 10th, we will have Agnes Kahl, PhD student of the Södertörn University in Stockholm, talking about institutionalization of AML supervision in the Baltics and Nordics. While in May 8th, we will have Jason Sharman from the Cambridge University, who will talk about Russian sanctions and anti-money laundering, quite hot topic in the current global debate. So having said that, I mute myself and leave the floor to Mirko for 15 minutes presentation, and then Mark for discussion, and then opening the floor for Q&A. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Michele. Thank you all for joining. I'll just go ahead sharing my screen. You should be able to see it. Okay.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. So, hi everyone. Thank you again for joining this webinar today. I'm actually going to share and present my latest research co-author with Peter Reuter from University of Maryland. It actually is forthcoming on the 54 volume of the Crime and Justice. It's called "How Effective is the Money Laundering Control System?" Well, the title gives it away, actually the topic of the discussion, and I will try to focus on how to measure the effectiveness of the system and what the data, in a way, tells us. Because as you have seen, maybe from the paper is actually quite long, so I don't expect you reading it all, and I don't expect you have already read it. I'll try to going straight forward on the key points that we try to highlight, and leave some topics out probably for the discussion by Mark later, and also the Q&A session. So just moving on. Okay.
So Mirko, can you put in full screen mode?
Oh yeah, sorry. I thought yeah. Thank you, Michele. Yeah, for what concerns the overview, this is just a brief overview of the study. So as you may already know, it's not in a way original research. We try to provide a comprehensive synthesis of existing literature, of existing data on the topic, and we try to triangulate, in a way, integrate diverse sources. We try to have multiple ones, to have, in a way, a robust picture of what is going on and what's happening in the anti-money laundering and the money laundering domain. Specifically, we relied on official reports from regulatory bodies and authorities, academic studies, and other types of peer-reviewed research, media investigations, of course, and also case studies that we found particularly interesting also to discuss. We use a very broad and, in a way, complex approach, and we try to tackle different issues. First of all, we try also to draw and develop a theoretical framework for evaluating the system and the effectiveness of the system. And we specifically laid a focus on the assessment of both intended and unintended consequences of the current AML system that, in a way, is often overlooked by both authorities and scholars, at least some of them. So an evaluation of the system must start from, stating what's the objective of the ML system. This can seem quite trivial, but it's quite challenging. It's not trivial at all, because we see there are, of course, actually quite different perspectives, I would say. So we have, in a way, the institutional perspective, and then we also have the research perspective, the research opinion, in a way. If you look at the official institutional focus, at the moment, the focus is on financial integrity. So the system that we have built and we are currently building and improving over time is focused on shielding the integrity of the system, shielding the financial system from, in a way, predicate offenses, of course, and money laundering. Here you have just 3 examples, but you can find more, of course, online. FATF, IMF, and FinCEN, that's the national intelligence unit for the US, that again focus on financial integrity. So FATF in 2019, in its updated mandate that it received in 2019 when it passed to be a permanent body, states that the role of FATF is protecting financial systems and broader economy. The IMF stress, the importance of strengthening financial sector integrity and security using AML standards, while the FinCEN focuses on safeguarding the financial system from illicit use. And then, of course, there is a longer quote, but it states money laundering and all other type of illicit financial arms, in a way. As I said before, there is, of course, in a way, a conflicting opinion between the institutional bodies and, in a way, operational reality, and also the theory of IML system. In a way, and most of you are familiar, of course, AML systems and the AML regime was born in a way to have a second, chance of getting criminals. It was born in the US, in a way, at least initially, to have a second shot at catching drug dealers and people involved in drug trafficking and illicit markets. If we cannot get these people for dealing drugs, we can get them for moving the money resulting from, for example, dealing drugs. This also was something that occurred in other countries as well. For example, Italy was the first country to criminalize money laundering in 1978. And they did that, for example, for catching, in a way, for catching people from Cosa Nostra, but also people from Brigate Rosse, so a terrorist organization, a left terrorist organization active in that period. So really, we were focused on reducing, in a way, predicate offenses. Money laundering itself was just an instrument. It was an intermediate, let's say, goal. We were not interested in tackling money laundering in itself. We were interested in tackling money laundering because we could reduce predicate offenses and crime, in a way, at large. So just as a concluding point, we know that, in a way, AML has never been and should not be, and we will get back later on this point about money laundering itself. But we saw, and we are seeing right now, that basically money laundering has become, in a way, the key focus of the system. So, of course, FATF, we need to speak a little bit about FATF. We know that it's, of course, the global standsetter about anti-money laundering and money laundering. And we are interested, and we were interested in the paper in understanding, of course, how FATF measures effectiveness. We all know about mutual evaluation reports. So this is the key, in a way, instrument and the key procedure that FATF uses for measuring the effectiveness of the system. And we know that they try to, of course, assess each country that, of course, is not only the members of the FATF, but also all the other countries that collaborate with FATF and are part of the FATF system for countering money laundering. And they actually try to assess 2 main dimensions, 2 main components: the technical compliance, so all the regulations, laws, policies that the country has in place to counter money laundering, and the effectiveness side. So how good is the system at doing what it was supposed to do, so countering, again, money laundering and all the other related harms. Well, FATF says basically whole from this procedure in 2022. It was the key findings from the final report of the 4th round, although some of the main evaluation are still happening from the 4th round, and we entered in the 5th one, saying that 97% of assessed countries, and there were in total 120 countries, show low to moderate effectiveness at tackling money laundering, at least according, again, to the FATF standards. And specifically in non-financial sector, was particularly weak in risk management and also assessing, the risks related to money laundering. So what's the problem? And again, in the paper we are focusing a whole section on mutual evaluation reports, because again, it's a key instrument in the FATF measurement of effectiveness. There are a couple of issues with MERS. The first one, of course, is that there is a sort of political influence in report finalization. So again, these are pure evaluations. So countries are assessed by other countries, by peers, of course. But we know that there is some political influence on the wording, for example, of the countries, because again, the final report is not a report by the assessors, but it is discussed, is a report by FATF, and FATF has the final say on the word and on the wording that go into the final report. And there is, of course, some tensions, let's say, between some of the state members when, that there, in a way, MERS needs to be final approved by the plenary session. What's the problem? But the really main problem is actually it's just a focus on formal compliance over actual outcomes. So in a way, FATF is more interested in understanding how countries, of course, relate and uphold to their standards over actual outcomes of the money laundering system. So just to go into the next slide, because I think it's clearer, FATF measures effectiveness. So how good are we at tackling money laundering, looking at the fact that the system that we built. And this is a vicious circle, and it's also problematic from an evaluation point of view, because we are just trying to measure how good we are looking at what we built. And we use this approach in the paper. Okay, so we said let's look at what FATF suggested and what FATF is doing right now, and we just use three main dimensions and three main instruments. So the suspicious activity reports, they have many names, suspicious transaction reports, and others in other countries, but basically it's what we ask in a way from our obliged entities, so from both the financial obliged entities and the non-financial one, saying, okay, you need to look and monitor your transactions and just please report to the authorities those that you think basically are suspicious and could involve some sort of illicit activities. We used money laundering convictions, and then also, of course, confiscation of assets related to crime. This first slide is about the first two dimensions, so suspicious activity reports and money laundering convictions. And I missed a key point, of course. In the paper, we just decided to focus on one country, the United States, in a way because it was one of the founders of the system itself and was one of the key advocates of the system. And also because they, at least we think they provide a good, they provide good statistics, good quality statistics that we use in the paper. Here you have just basically two main variables. So again, the suspicious activity reports on the right side, and on the left, the money laundering convictions. And you can see they have two completely different trends, I would say. So the number of suspicious activity reports really skyrocketed from 1996 to 2023, going from few thousands actually to more than 4 million last year, 2 years ago. Actually, it's in 2023. While on the contrary, the number of money laundering convictions has been pretty stagnant in a way, oscillating between 800 to 1,200 money laundering conviction per each year. Again, we assume in a way, and the system assumes that these two variables are related, and FATF says that in a couple of reports, including, for example, the 2016 money laundering evaluation report of the United States. FATF clearly stated that they expected money laundering convictions to be higher because they should reflect the problem magnitude, so the problem that the country is facing in terms of money laundering and illicit finance. And again, there is a need for proportional enforcement of outcomes. In a way, we stress in the paper, we try to make the case that these two variables actually are not really directly related, but the suspicious activity reports are really contributing to a different dimension, again, to crime reducing purposes. Again, in a way, US data supports this view, although tentatively, I would say. So here there is a list of key statistics in the paper. You can find more of them, basically of US authorities that use BSA data, so by the Bank Secrecy Act of the 1970, and basically, it's the national law for money laundering, together with the Money Laundering Control Act of the 1986, to tackle money laundering during their activities and investigations. For example, there was a survey of 6 federal law enforcement agencies from the US Government Accountability Office, and these 6 federal law enforcement agencies reported that 72% of their personnel use BSA data during their investigations on a daily basis. The same goes for criminal investigations by the IRS. 88% of IRS criminal investigations used BSA filings in 2023 investigations, and the same goes for the this is actually the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force. This is an office in the DOJ that use basically, again, for the basically the totality of their investigation, use BSA data on a daily basis. Again, really SARS, we need to think to SARS, of course, as intelligence. This is what they serve, but they are not used mainly for money laundering investigations. They are also used for investigations in other domains, in trying to tackle different crimes and reducing crimes. Again, this is, of course, is the key takeaway from these sections, but we wanted to highlight the importance, of course, of suspicious activity reports in building intelligence, because, of course, even if a suspicious activity report does not result in a money laundering conviction, we argue that it is important. So we should not really look into money laundering convictions to try to understand, if we are doing a good job, but there are other variables and other metrics that we could use. This goes to the asset seizure, again, is for the United States, and we can see this is basically the asset seizures related to money laundering statutes from 2018 to 2022. Here, the situation is less positive, let's say. So we see that basically, again, on the left side axis, you see the number of assets seized each year, while on the right side, in billions of dollars, you see the amount of these assets. And we can see that basically there is actually a decreasing trend over time, both in terms of number of assets and in the terms of the total value, excluding a spike in 2019. And basically the downtrending trend basically reflects, potentially the COVID, of course, COVID-19 lockdown and difficulties in enforcing these issues over time. But again, we are really, in a way, not doing so great in terms of seizing criminal assets. This is well known, not only in difficulties, for example, of locating these assets, especially in transnational cases, but then also really seizing these assets, for example, if they are, of course, in another jurisdiction or if rather under the name of another person and so on and so forth. I'll just go really brief on these because there are many other things that I want to discuss. Basically, we said, okay, we are trying to look at what the FATF says, and we are trying to look at an alternative perspective. Instead of looking at the outputs of the system that, in a way, we have already said, but do not really provide a good basis for understanding how good we are at tackling money laundering, let's look at money laundering itself. So let's look at the phenomenon, the criminal phenomenon that the system, in a way, is trying to tackle. So according, a common arms race, we are saying, okay, we are getting good at tackling money laundering over time, and the system should make money laundering more complex, more difficult, costlier, and so on and so forth. At least we can measure it looking at 2 main dimensions. So the use of ever new and more sophisticated methods by offenders. If offenders, if we are getting better and better at identifying illicit transactions, then they should, try different methods and more sophisticated ones. And then on the side, the growing reliance on professional money launderers, that there are criminals who provide these services, so professional money laundering services for a fee, basically based on a market exchange, nothing more. But we should see at least partially these 2 trends, okay? Well, again, literature and I want to highlight that, of course, is a small literature. We are well aware of that. There are few scholars who have tried to focus on the money laundering threats and the phenomenon itself rather than the AML literature. But a few studies highlight three main findings in a way. So the persistence of simple laundering strategies, the limited adoption of sophisticated methods and new ones as cryptocurrencies and so on and so forth, and the predominance of self-laundering over professional services. So what are the three main takeaways here? First of all, and this is in a way, and it was at the basis of try to looking money laundering threats, is that of course we can infer what's going on in the money laundering domain by looking at how offenders, behave. So if simple works in a way, why make it harder? If we can make it out with, using simple methods, really using more sophisticated methods that they are riskier, of course, because we may need to rely on technologies that we are not fully aware, for example, as cryptocurrencies and so on and so forth, is not really meaningful. It can be problematic, so we should rely on simple methods. Money laundering has not become more difficult or costlier. And again, basic money laundering, that what really emerged from the literature are not likely to be detected by AML control. If I have, for example, a drug offender who spends most of his money that are like in cash proceeds, most likely in daily expenses and so on and so forth, it's difficult that those type of transactions are detected by, for example, his local bank and so on and so forth. So there is also this mismatch that I think it's important to highlight. One of course, of the main criticisms that one could move to this type of evidence is that, of course, we are looking
Mirko,
at...
Sorry,
Yeah.
Mirko, 1 minute to conclude.
Yeah, sorry. We are looking at a literature that relies on law enforcement data. And of course, in a way, we are mirroring what law enforcement data are looking. So what are the resources, what are the constraints, the priorities, and so on and so forth. But in a way, there is a new branch of literature that has tried to also explore alternative data sources, as, for example, cryptocurrencies transactions. And they found that, for example, even successful offenders that have never been caught, never been arrested, and so on, use simple laundering strategies. So I think that this is saying something to us, and we need to take that into account. I'll just actually skip this slide, and sorry for being late, and just move to the final slide. So again, what are the current challenges? We know, okay, the system potentially is not working. In the slide before that I skipped, I wanted to also say that, of course, this is not working, but there are also potential and unintended consequences that are happening right now. We need to be aware of that. But rather than talking about reform and changing the whole system, we are focusing on incremental improvements. So adding, for example, new obliged entities, new sectors, controlling even more and even tighter some sectors, but not really trying to take a whole reforming approach in a way. And I wanted also to highlight, the current system, if it's sustainable over time or not. I'll just stop here because I know I'm late, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Mirko. Immediately leave the floor to Mark. Mark, 10-12 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, great. I will try to be, we're almost at 11:30 already, so I'm going to try to be very brief here, cut out some of what I was going to say, just so we have time for discussion, because I think there's an interesting group of people on this, and I'd like to hear their comments. So, the authors are basically grading the system, the AML system, FATF, as part of that, and very simply, it fails, right, is the argument, I think, is a fairly simple way to do that, say that. And so, but I think there's some things that we can sort of pick up on. I think it's the paper does a nice job of really sort of covering the full institutional landscape of the AML regime, a little bit, I guess, a little bit less on terrorism financing than on other aspects, which is something to pick up on maybe. But I think there's a service provided in introducing it in a way to an audience maybe that's not as familiar with it. But let me sort of pick on a couple of things just quickly. I think I don't think it's entirely fair to say there's not a debate over FATF. It's sort of framed that way at the beginning. I think, in fact, in the sort of starting in the late 2010s into the 2020s in particular, you see I would argue that FATF is facing calls on its legitimacy unlike it has ever faced before. and that's in part due to academic work on it. So I think it is worth noting that right now, even before January, which I'll come back to, we were in a moment where some of the assumptions around this are being questioned, and I think so. It's an interesting time. This is a timely discussion that we're having. I want to look at mechanisms. This is always a thing, and there's a section on mechanisms. Really focuses ultimately on financial sanctions at the national level for violations. So banks, the fines that they pay, and so on. At the international level via the black and gray lists, really. And obviously, we've had conversations, and some of us have written about the debate over black and gray lists. But basically, the authors write that domestically, the effective penalties for bad behavior are unclear, which I thought, especially given that Peter Reuter's co-author, was a uncharacteristically indirect way of saying they don't really suffer that much, right? And Faveta's work on the reputational effects on banks confirm that. There's a little bump in the road, perhaps, but for the most part, they go back to it. In fact, there's some evidence that maybe some of them benefit from it. What someone has called the advertising effect a little bit. So I think that's, and I think, I'll be clear, I think the FATF lists as they're currently used are an abuse of power, and they've become more so. I also think they're counterproductive. I think they encourage strategic interaction with FATF and the assessors rather than a more open sort of diagnostic form of interaction. But I think there are other mechanisms in FATF that don't get the attention that they should, and this is particular coming from an international relations perspective and an IR and a sort of organizational side. But I have long argued that we can think about FATF and evaluate FATF as a system for generating and disseminating knowledge about a particularly difficult problem that's difficult to solve. And so, and it doesn't, that's not to say that it performs brilliantly on that front, but I think it highlights some mechanisms that are there, the role, again, that the MERs can play, the mutual evaluations, which the authors talk about a little bit, the typologies report fit into that, the capacity building work that goes on under the umbrella of the AML regime. I think we need a much more comprehensive understanding of the mechanisms that are at play in this. If the goal is to assess the effectiveness or points of weakness or ineffectiveness in the regime, I think we need that discussion to move well beyond the sort of financial sanctions that either states or actors within states face. They raise some should questions, which I think are important, right? And that is, what should the AML regime try to accomplish? Crime reduction has been there from the beginning. There have been others who have doubted that from the very beginning. That's really the goal. But I wonder what difference it would make if FATF sort of started there or restarted there, go back to crimes, focus on some major ones, and build up, again, a body of knowledge around typologies and approaches to dealing with those rather than the way that it's done now. And I wonder, I don't really know the answer to this. I wonder how it would look different. It's perhaps better a question for criminologists than international relations scholars like myself. I think the question of global enforcement versus local sort of prevention, I'll say, is an interesting one that comes up in the paper. There are lots of absurd situations. The authors bring up South Sudan in the middle of a civil war, and they're put on the gray list. Right? Who the hell cares what South Sudan is doing? Honestly, they have bigger problems to deal with. And I think that's because, and the authors highlight this heuristic even of the weakest link has taken hold. Global problems require global solutions, and the chain's only as strong as its weakest link. And there's some logic to that, but I think people in those weakest link countries would tell you that they feel like they're barely in the chain at all. They're trying desperately to hold on. And so to suggest that they're somehow having these structural effects that are going to disrupt the integrity of the financial system is just beyond credibility. And so I think a return to the early days of FATF, when the goal, before the goal became to sort of extraterritorialize the whole thing and force it on states that were involved in its formation, so that we need sort of tiers of countries like many countries do now with banks, right? Staggered by their importance in the financial system, where the most central are held to the strictest standard. The challenge with that is it requires, those are the ones already in charge of the system. And so it requires them taking that on. But I think trying to enforce AML on South Sudan really just undermines the shaky legitimacy of the entire project already. So there is some good news on this and movement under the current presidency of FATF around how the MERs are going to be done and how often evaluations will be done. Those bigger banks will face, or those bigger states will face more frequent evaluations. But as the authors point out fairly convincingly, those evaluations and the reports only go so far. I want to go then generally also, and this is reflecting a little bit on conversations that happen, I know, around the Bahamas conference and so on. There's increasingly a certain amount of confidence or even maybe bravado among academic researchers, I think, and I think it comes up a little here in declaring that AML and FATF have just failed, right? There are little spots of sunshine, right, where we have law enforcement using it, but otherwise it seems we're increasingly confident in sort of declaring the sort of emperor completely naked. And so I want to challenge that just a little bit. One is still that basic point of, the lack of evidence of something is not the same as evidence of the lack of something. And while I recognize that there is good evidence that there are serious flaws in the system in places it doesn't work, I think, again, a more comprehensive view of the system might find that there is something going on that is worth picking out. And then in so doing, we can think about how to strengthen those aspects. And again, imperfection is the part of any regulatory system, so that surely can't be the standard. Who's to blame in this? The states are there, they deserve blame. FATF gets blamed, and that line between what is FATF and is it states and all that gets blurred a lot. I think we need more discussion of regulators in this. I know around de-risking, which is something I followed kind of closely. I know one person who's been very influential in the whole regime has talked about de-risking is really just regulator risk. It depends on which person walks in the door. And so, some investigation on that level is important. I think banks tend to get off kind of easy, right? We sort of have this way of saying, well, of course banks behave badly, right? Of course banks are trying to launder money, maybe. But the state's job is to stop them. We hold the state to a higher standard than banks. And so I think I do wonder sometimes if we got rid of, there's sort of this underlying assumption that banks want to try to stop money laundering in a lot of work. And I wonder how we would see things differently if we really faced that and took it on and just how we would assess things differently. And sort of final point on this issue, and then I have one other point to make and I'll be done. The test of this really is, so, okay, we say that it fails. It's easy to critique. There are lots of good reasons to do that. It deserves to be critiqued. Those are valuable. But are we really saying, and this is important at this moment in time, and from the U.S. perspective especially, are we willing to say to just throw it all out, right? Because I feel like increasingly it sounds that way, right? But increasingly it's just failed. It doesn't work. It's all kind of ridiculous. And so what are we doing? But are we willing to sign on and say, okay, then just throw it out and let's go back to the time when that wasn't the case? And if we're not willing to say that, then I think it behooves us to be maybe a little more either productive, if you want to think of it, in our criticisms, or humble in our assertions, especially given that the basis of those are usually, well, we don't have data. And so there, on one hand, we don't have any data in this system to show that it works. And yet we're increasingly confident in saying, we know that it doesn't work. There's sort of an inherent tension there. Final point, just because, what now? Where are we going with this? And what does this regime look like in the case where the U.S. is systematically dismantling a system that was at least lightly based on rules that it helped build? And when we're, I think, just days away from all of this being unwound entirely, or at least attempting to unwind it by vested interests that are running the U.S. government at this point. So I'll stop there because I want to have this discussion. Look forward to it.
Thank you, Mark. Very good points and thoughts. Before passing back the word to Mirko, I would open the floor for a question from the audience, and then give the final 5 minutes to Mirko to answer, or the input. So the floor is open. Any question you can put in the chat or just intervene and ask. I have a comment myself, but I leave the other first. So Vincent, please.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm Vincent Freigang. I'm a researcher at Transparency International. I was very curious to get kind of more of your thoughts on that point around the empirical evidence around the complexity of money laundering techniques, and sort of pulling from that the argument that the efforts currently in place are insufficient or not working. And I wondered, to what degree do you think that the empirical evidence base suggesting continued simple measures being used is largely a product of the way in how this sort of data can be captured and the biases that this might reflect? You briefly touched upon it, right? If you're using enforcement data, we know that law enforcement in many countries only goes after simple cases because it's easy to prove. The incentives at a law enforcement level are such that going after complex cases is difficult and it's not done. Hence, they don't show up in any sort of statistics later on. You mentioned briefly that the cryptocurrency data that's going to be used is sort of a way of trying to circumvent that. But yeah, I was wondering to get your a bit more detailed thoughts on the degree to which you think that is just a reflection of those points, because I would argue that also on the qualitative perspective, when we look at specific cases of kind of especially of complex, high-level corruption-related money laundering, as we care about at our end, the complexity does indeed tend to rise quite substantially. And yeah, was keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Vincent. Michael?
Yeah, I'd perhaps like us to think about what would count as enough impact. Yeah, there's a tendency, not least in the executive orders, to think about the total elimination of all transnational organized crime. But yeah, I think it's more useful to think about what would we consider an acceptable or defensible amount of impact, bearing in mind the points that Mark was making about different factors that are not considered in the paper. Yeah, that might have some impacts. In the light, for example, of the US getting a bad review in its forthcoming mutual evaluation report, which might lead the president to just abandon FATF as he has other things because it's not working, in inverted commas. I'd just add that and allow you to ask your question or make your point before you go, Chair.
Thank you. Any more question? So maybe before collecting new questions, I leave Mirko to answer this first round and Mark's comment.
Yeah, thank you, Michele, and thanks, first of all, to Mark for his comprehensive overview and also discussion of the paper. Of course, there are many things that we need in a way to leave out of the paper. In a way, it was almost 50 pages, but there are many other topics that we did not touch and we wanted to. So we know that this is actually a first level examination of the system, and there are many other things that we wanted again to say. Yeah, probably I was too harsh in the presentation. I think that in the paper, and hopefully it didn't sound like that, but in a way, of course, we are aware that no, it's not definitive that the system is failing. There are, of course, some things that probably are working, some things that are not. We are all aware of that. And I do not think, for example, that we need to throw everything out of the system, of the window, of course, or the system and the controls that we implemented over the years and the decades. I think that there is good of that. for example, what's going on with the suspicious activity reports, for example, I think it's quite a good example. We know that they are contributing to investigations, to different type of investigation, predicate offense, and so on and so forth. But for example, I'm not sure if the system is sustainable over time. We hear complaints about different financial intelligence units all over the world. FinCEN is one, the Italian UIF is another one, complaining about the number of suspicious activity reports that they receive each year from their obliged entities. I mean, in Italy, there are a couple of studies, but there are also other in other countries calling this type of reporting, as a crying wolf syndrome. The obliged entities, they tend just to report everything because they do not want to get fined. This is, but in a way, it's has been also empirically demonstrated in some contexts. So I'm not sure if, for example, FinCEN receiving 4 million SARS each year is something that we can meaningfully tackle, or at least in the most effective way, in the most meaningful way from the investigative point of view. But still, these suspicious activity reports are useful. So we potentially need just to adjust how we manage this data, or how we want obliged entities to file these reports. And this is already something that's happening. If you look at numbers, for example, from Switzerland, okay, it's a whole different country, but we know that, for example, he has a developed financial sector. He has some issues in terms of money laundering. Well, the system and the number are completely different. And also the types, of course, of suspicious activity reports that are reported are different, because the authority required them to report different transactions. They need to, for example, before reporting a suspicious activity reports, just double checking if they meet certain thresholds, and so on and so forth. So again, I think that I have a few minutes, so I just wanted also to move to the other comments. First, Vincent, thank you again for your comment. I think it was a really on point comment. Again, in the paper, you can find the whole set of studies that we reviewed, and that basically they are the existing ones, the ones that try to assess, what's going on in terms of money laundering methods from an empirical point of view. So they looked in a way at cases. Most of them, again, I said it in the presentation, and you underlined it correctly, they use enforcement data. This is problematic. We know it, because again, we are just mirroring, priorities, resources, constraints, and also, of course, there is a street lamp effect. So law enforcement agencies, in a way, are looking where it's easier for them to look. This is true. Still, I think that the evidence that is emerging from these studies is important, is meaningful. Also, again, because there are new studies that use different approaches, different data sources. There are a couple of studies, for example, that just talk to convict money launderers. There are few of them, but they exist. And they report, for example, again, simple methods. There are studies that try to investigate money laundering transactions occurring like in the crypto domain. Again, that's not really just so complicated schemes. This is not to say that complicated schemes and sophisticated schemes do not exist. They do. But again, not all money launderers, or at least offenders who engage in money launderers, behave the same. Again, based on what they need to do, they use different methods, they use different strategies, and so on and so forth. A drug dealer, a drug trafficker is not the same as a kleptocrat or a politician involved in a corruption scheme, and so on and so forth, as is not the same as a cyber criminal, for example, dealing with cryptocurrencies and other tech-savvy strategies. So again, I think that this is really changed from the perspective we are looking at the phenomenon. So if we are looking at drug traffickers, yeah, well, we can really look at simple methods, and this has been proved and demonstrated by research with all the constraints we are aware of. But I think it's something that's happening. But again, it's not to rule out complex schemes. These do indeed exist, and it's also important to tackle that, to study these schemes. Just moving to Mike's comment again, another important point. I don't think I have an answer for that, because again, I don't think where is the final line when we need to say, okay, yeah, we are good, we are doing enough to tackle predicate crimes, terrorist financing, of course, that, as Mark said, we didn't really touch in the paper, and that was probably something we should have, and all other, of course, money laundering. I think that in a way, again, there are some things that we are doing well, and there are some things we are doing bad. I agree also again with Mark, and I want to stress this point because probably I was not clear. When we say that there is no political or at least policy debate about reforming the system, this is partially true in the sense that, of course, we are well aware that there have been criticism to FATF, first of all, and FATF is acknowledging some of these shortcomings, is changing some of also the elements of the system. We think, for example, to the mutual evaluation reports and how, for example, also differencing between, developing country and undeveloped country for entering, for example, the grey list and the blacklist. This is something that was criticized because, again, Mark made the case of South Sudan being in the grey list. If I am on money laundering, I don't know if I want my money to be there in South Sudan, but still, it's something that could happen. Again, it's a variegated landscape. But really, yeah, just to conclude my comments. I'm not sure where we need to draw the line, Mike, in terms of what we are doing, if it's enough or not. And I would also love to hear your comments on that, what you think it would be, in a way, enough. Thank you. But thank you all for all the comments, and maybe if there are many others. I mean, Peter and I are happy about receiving feedbacks and to also tune some reasonings we are doing right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirko. Any more comments or questions? I have one, but so there is in the chat. I read Siam Varma questions. So what are number one or two things that is recommended to improve in terms of AML programs at organizational level? And second question, in the paper, it is mentioned there is less availability of data. Any recommendation on how a financial institution organization can contribute to research and improvement of AML methods and procedures without compromising privacy of the data? I think the second question is very relevant, of course. Mirko or somebody else would like to provide a short answer.
I mean, I'll jump in on the second one. I think you saw various sort of academic heads nod at that second question. I don't know that we have the answer to that. I know that there are various banking people on this, and I've had others sort of talk to me about this. I think on the academic side, there's a great deal of enthusiasm of figuring out a way that banking could provide some of that data. Personally, I have no idea how that works. I know there's a lot of sort of data security questions that come into play, but I am confident that most of the academics on this call would gladly have a conversation to sort of figure out what are the obstacles and whether those can be worked around.
Yes, I think that Joras can also say something about that, so that he raised a hand. So
so I recently published a paper on which has showed that financial institutions can use synthetic data to show the relevance of their mechanisms and testing what works and what doesn't. And we show in the paper that the results on the synthetic data are similar as the results on real data. And the synthetic data is data based on the real data, but without any specific link to any individual or any individual transaction. So there's no privacy concerns when you use synthetic data, but the methods can still be tested in a similar way. We also we built a synthetic data set. And so this data set can be used to show to what extent the system that might be in place somewhere works and can be compared also with other systems that might be in place. So we're trying to, in that way, to improve on this. Maybe now that I have the floor, I might want to add a little comment or question also towards the paper or towards Mirko. So if I zoom out and look at the system, what we see is a moving goalpost. We see constantly, and so this is a bit in line with what Mike already said about when is it enough. we see that over time, the recommendations get intensified, the checks get intensified, there's more and more checks. And also some countries are at some point complaining about this moving goalpost, that we think every time you're almost near the goalpost get moved. But you can also say this might be an indication that we're going in a certain direction, that there is something being built upon. You're not going to move the goalpost if you never get close. And so maybe if we zoom out and we see that this goalpost is being moved, we can start complaining about how far we are away from the goalpost at certain points in time. And you pointed out that, what was it, 97% of the countries were low and moderate effectiveness in terms of, yes, the current goalpost. If we go back a decade or two, then we might be very close to the goalpost. Back then, we were very happy if at least money laundering was criminalized and a certain number of institutions were set up to deal with them. So maybe this moving goalpost is actually an indication of the other way around than failing effectiveness.
Thank you, Joras. So 2 points from myself, if I may. One is exactly, I share my colleagues' comments about this over-criticism of the system. I think the fact that the system itself is not able to demonstrate that is effective doesn't mean that it is failing. Okay, I think we do not have the ability at the moment to demonstrate the effectiveness of the system, but do not have the ability even to demonstrate its failure. This is at least my belief. And actually, you mentioned one thing. In Italy was one of the first countries to introduce strict AML measures, and the reason at that time was Cosa Nostra and Brigate Rosse. And if you see the story, I mean, Brigate Rosse have disappeared, and Cosa Nostra almost disappeared. Also, the investigation we had 2 days ago demonstrated that it's really a very weakened organization. Obviously, this is not just because of the anti-money laundering, especially the Brigate Rosse, but at least for Cosa Nostra, I think the contribution was pretty important. So, I mean, if you look micro, sometimes you can even find success stories about AML system. Then a more specific point regarding the use of SARS and STR by law enforcement. I think that it would be useful to understand to what extent law enforcement can use the information in these reports, because it is not the same way they can access this information all over the countries. So I think it could be really useful to understand in which countries do law enforcement or can use this information, and where law enforcement has direct access to this information, if in fact we can see some effect on predicate offenses as well.
Yeah, no, thank you, Michele. These are both great points. Again, yeah, we were over critics of the system, but in a way, of course, you know, I think it's difficult. Again, I think it's difficult to evaluate the system. We try to make the case in the paper because we have multiple goals, we have multiple mechanisms, we have multiple ways why it's working, why it's not working, and of course, there are both cases where we can say, okay, yes, money laundering, anti-money laundering standards and anti-money laundering controls have contributed to, for example, crippling criminal organizations or supporting investigations, and some other cases where we can say that, for example, FATF standards have also been abused and they've also been used for illicit purposes. There are a couple of cases, and there was a recent study by Siver Reimer from, you know, the RUSI called the weaponization of FATF standards, where they said, of course, there are some certain type of governments that can abuse this type of information, because again, in the ultimate case, you know, the main output of the system is information. Then how this information is stored, how this information is used, of course, not just in terms of, for example, privacy and data leaks, but also, yes, again, how you use them, for what purposes. This is something also that I don't see deserved, let's say, debate on that. But I agree with you that for sure there are a couple of successful cases. And again, it's not just a matter of changing completely the system, because I think that there are many things that are working that we can improve, and we can for sure also develop further. Actually, I don't remember, Michele, your second point. Sorry about that. If you could just
no, just to the access by law enforcement to
yes,
stuff.
thank you. Thank you. Sorry. That would be another interesting study. I mean, I have another study on the Italian side that's under review. So, but I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting because there are many challenges, of course, also in terms of communication between the national FIU and the law enforcement agencies, and also about what, for example, and this is again a really different landscape. So in some countries, and I think your point is really relevant, in some countries, for example, as Italy, the national FIU needs to pass all suspicious activity reports to the law enforcement by law. So they need to pass everything, although for some of them, they do not find them relevant at all, but they are constrained in a way to send them all. In other countries, there is a first layer of investigation and internal investigation by the UIF, and some of them are not sent to law enforcement agencies. So I think that there are some subjectivity here that needs to be addressed. But for sure, I think it's important, and an element, also another element, it's important to discuss. Again, it's the number of suspicious activity reports, because it's something that in a way it's clogging the system, and the same people responsible for them are complaining about. So I think that here we can do something better. But again, I think that suspicious activity reports, potentially compared to other instruments, can be really something useful, because again, even if, for example, a suspicious activity report is filed in 2018, it can be stored and it can be used, for example, in investigation 5 years later. This is still useful, because that piece of information is not just lost in time, it's stored, and we can it's actionable in a way, intelligence. So we are really building, again, an actionable database, but still it can also misused, as also the Italian case showed. So there can be some data leaks about suspicious activity reports, so they can be used for some not so good reasons. But I don't know if I answered your points. Thank you again for the comments.
Thank you. Unless there are other questions. No, so I would like to thank Mirko, Nazzari, and Peter Reuter as presenters, and Mark Nance as discussant, and all those of you who have contributed to today's discussion. This webinar will be recorded, so you can find it in the Money Laundering Research Network website, where you will find also the next 4 months titles for the next webinars. Just as a concluding point, we will also send you an email shortly to all the members of the network about the possibility to present papers for academic conferences on money laundering. More detail in the email which will be coming next. Thank you indeed. Bye bye.